Good afternoon. I'm Jim Foster, Director of the City Club. Welcome to our 100-year-old Citadel of Free Speech. The Governor of Ohio recently released his biennial budget, a plan which very clearly reflects Governor Kasich's philosophy of government. That is, to increase employment by making the state more attractive to business development. He does this in large part by shifting Ohio's taxes from heavy reliance on income taxes toward greater reliance on consumption taxes. There are, of course, many other ways that the proposed plan affects Ohio citizens, either directly or by the impact that it has on communities and school districts. Of course, some people like the plan and some people don't. Here to slice and dice the budget proposals and what they mean for the citizens of Ohio is a panel of experts. John Begala and Zach Schiller will be formally introduced by our moderator, Mike McIntyre. And we're delighted to have Mike join us again. He has moderated a number of programs for the City Club, but is probably better known for his tip-off column in The Plain Dealer and his hosting of The Sound of Ideas on 90.3 WCPN. I'm delighted to turn the program over now to Mike McIntyre. Mike?
Thank you very much, Jim. And congratulations on your recently announced retirement. Ohio Governor John Kasich, as Jim mentioned, unveiled his proposed spending blueprint this month, covering the next 2 years. The legislature now has Ohio House Bill 59. It's light reading at just 4,200 pages. Some might say it's a good sign that those on both sides of the political aisle have found aspects of the budget to love and aspects they'd like to change or scrap. The governor said he's proud to take Ohio from an $8 billion budget hole 2 years ago to what he projects would be a $1.9 billion surplus at the end of this budget cycle. Let's talk about some highlights. The governor, while being careful to say he's still no fan of Obamacare, wants Ohio to opt into the Medicaid expansion prescribed by the Affordable Care Act. The budget lays out a new formula for calculating state aid to schools that's meant to be more equitable. The poor will get more, he said, but there's still much confusion about how that would work, especially since many poor districts are not in fact getting more, and many rich ones are. And then there are the taxes. The governor proposes cutting the 5.5% state sales tax to 5%, but extending its reach to a number of services never before subjected to the state sales tax. There would be exemptions for such services as health care, education, and housing. We'll talk about that today. The governor also wants to cut income taxes by 20% for individuals and 50% for small businesses. That's plenty to start our conversation. Let me introduce our experts this morning, or this afternoon, actually. John Begala is with us. He's Executive Director of the Center for Community Solutions. Mr. Begala had a multifaceted career as a leader in public policy, executive of health and social service organizations, and as an educator. He actually served as executive director of the Center for Community Solutions from 1998 through 2004, and then returned in July 2008 after several years of retirement. John Begala is with us, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, John. And also joining us this afternoon, I always say this morning because I host a morning show, so bear with me. This afternoon is Zach Schiller. He's Research Director of Policy Matters Ohio. Prior to coming to Policy Matters in 2001, Mr. Schiller had more than 2 decades of experience researching and writing about the Ohio economy as a business reporter for The Plain Dealer and for Business Week. Zach Schiller is with us. The way this is going to work is our guests are going to have a few minutes to sort of lay out their thoughts about the budget. We're going to talk a little bit here, and then, of course, the traditional City Club question and answer period. So do think about the questions you'd like to ask, and we'll have folks coming around to allow you to do that throughout the program. One of the things I wanted to bring up, John Begala, is you said that this was an example. You said this budget is not business as usual. This is an op-ed piece that you pointed out. You said is not business as usual. Indeed, it'll be an achievement of historic importance, both for its substance and its break with the hyper-partisanship of recent years, if it gets through the General Assembly intact. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, the most interesting thing I think about this budget are the risks that the governor was willing to take in putting some big things on the table, and the overall balance that he appears to have been trying to achieve in doing so. On the tax side, you've got what you might expect from a conservative governor in proposed cuts to the income tax rates across the board, a huge tax exemption in the S corporation exemption for small businesses and others. But most interestingly, from our organization's perspective, is what's proposed on the sales tax, which is a vast expansion, over 80 by my count, of expansion of the coverage of the sales tax and reducing the rate. This is the kind of approach that many organizations from the political right to the left have been proposing for years, both for the federal tax code as well as for various taxes in the state of Ohio. And I think it takes some, I mean, he's obviously going to cross a number of interests in the process of doing that. But as a matter of principle, it's something that I think raises the level of the discussion on these issues in Columbus and could set a whole new direction for the way we approach the sales tax in Ohio long term. The expansion to services that would finally catch up with what happened in the economy a couple of decades ago. On the spending side, there's a little bit of disappointment right now with regard to what isn't happening for some of the large districts in an increase for primary and secondary education. On the other hand, though, there is a significant amount of new money for schools for the first time in a while. And the General Assembly will have an opportunity to work with the formula that with the former chair of the Finance Committee of the House here in the room, Pat Sweeney, can tell you that those formulas get a good working over as they make their way through. There'll be some opportunities for people to deal with that. The biggest piece and the biggest break from what many people expected is the expansion of Medicaid. And I could go on about this and probably will at great length before we're done here today. But between 900,000 and 1 million more Ohioans will get health care coverage as a result of this. It is, to my mind, the most important part, the most significant part, and the most principled part of the Affordable Care Act, the one that has the greatest integrity from just a policy perspective. I think that it's an important move. I think that it's one that has both political as well as policy implications, and that the governor probably has weighed those very carefully. And it's going to be an interesting few months watching the politics of that as they try to get it through House and the Senate, where the partisanship of the last election still hasn't completely dissipated.
To put it lightly. Zach Schiller, let's talk about first, and I'd like to hear your thoughts in general, but about the Medicaid and the idea, the Medicaid expansion, the idea that was a surprise. It wasn't in the last few weeks, as the governor sort of signaled that this might happen, that he didn't link this with some endorsement of the Affordable Care Act. But overall, it was a surprise, it seems, and it's also surprising that organizations such as yours, that generally come from a very liberal perspective, are praising the governor for this move. Usually, you don't see budgets from conservative governors that your organization celebrates or applauds any portion of. Talk a little bit about that.
I mean, we certainly do applaud that, and I think it shows that you know, we're interested in seeing good policy, and whoever puts it forward will applaud it. And you know, as John mentioned on the sales tax issue, we also think that we ought to broaden the sales tax, and that too is a good proposal, although we need to see some measures taken to make sure low-income people aren't too negatively affected. But I think on the Medicaid issue, I sort of would defer to John because I think he's the bigger expert on this. But you know, I think it became a little more politically possible when you had the governor of Arizona endorsing this. He's not the only Republican governor out there who's supporting this kind of thing. And you know, if you look at it from a commonsensical standpoint, it's kind of a no-brainer. You know, I mean, you're covering huge numbers of new people. You're bringing new money into the Ohio economy. You're going to help the budget with this. You're going to create a better situation in terms of how people get their health care. And so I think that the opposition to it is pretty much just ideological. And I think the fact that the governor has endorsed it, you know, it indicates that you know, this is something that people from different political persuasions can agree on. Let me make one other point just to say generally about the budget. You know, I think that we need to back up and look at how we got to where we are now. And as much as we favor a couple of the key proposals in here, the Medicaid expansion and the sales tax broadening, this budget does not make the public investments that are needed in this state. And it continues the same kind of shift of the tax burden to lower and middle income people, and it continues with this mistaken notion that by cutting taxes we're going to improve the economy. And so while I think that there are very significant elements of this that are would be real steps forward for the state, it really still has a lot of flaws.
We'll talk about taxes and education spending and other issues as we move into the question and answer portion as well. But staying on the Medicaid issue, Governor Jan Brewer was in favor of that in Arizona. There are other governors, conservative governors, that were not in favor of the expansion. Am I correct on that? So it isn't a no-brainer to everybody. And I wonder, when you look at this politically in Ohio, the fact that this has been laid before a conservative legislature, John Begala, if you think that we're going to see a real Donnybrook over this, or is this one of those things that will get through?
We've got 5 months or so between now and the time that the budget is done, and a lot of quiet and public conversations will occur between now and the end of this process that I think will win a lot of people over. You know, what's fascinating about this is the interplay of what's going on in Washington with what's going on at the state. You've got a governor that is hitting his full stride, obviously, in this budget, willing to take some risks. You've got a second-term president now that's doing the same thing in somewhat of a different direction down in D.C. And how these things play out and how federal policy, national policy that comes through state governments work their way through are working. There are a lot of moving pieces right now. So, for example, you've got the president proposing universal early childhood stuff. Well, the state of Ohio has been investing increasingly in early childhood programs for a number of years. How is that going to play out in the federal system? How does that interact with investments the state is already making in that regard? We don't know. On the Medicaid piece, this came up in testimony yesterday down in Columbus. You've got some state legislators that are asking questions about, you know, this is fine and good. We'll bring lots of new federal money to the state of Ohio. Good. Providers are going to get paid. Good. Health status is likely to improve. Good. More people insured. Good. But what about the federal deficit and the federal debt? And what is our role as state legislators in the process? The fact that that is there in the middle of this discussion, I think, is going to be the most difficult challenge that they'll have with the Republican members of the General Assembly. Another thing that's going on, we were talking about this earlier, is a movement to try to take the Medicaid stuff out of the budget bill and try to deal with it separately. That would allow the Democrats to vote for it, the Republicans to vote, or most Republicans who want to vote against it, to vote against it. And there are people on both sides of the aisle that are tossing that idea out there, I think kind of experimenting with the idea of the what-ifs. Extracting the biggest part of state spending out of the biennial budget strikes me as something that's unlikely to happen after all the speculation and everything is done. But obviously people are looking at the votes and starting to make their counts about what if this and what if that. And right now, on the Medicaid stuff, there undoubtedly are well over 50 votes for it in the House. The question is, how do you get that vote to happen? And I'm not sure we know that yet.
Happy to take your questions on the Medicaid issue. We'll move on now to talk a little bit, though, about taxes. The governor promised when he came into office that he would lower income taxes. This is a delivery on that promise. Income taxes will go down by 20% for individuals over 3 years. Zach Schiller, you've just stated you think that's not a good idea. Why is it a bad idea to give Ohioans back some of their money that they're paying in taxes?
Well, for one thing, that's not really what's happening here. This is a tax shift where you're raising taxes in one place to pay for a tax cut in another. And that tax cut will go principally to the most affluent Ohioans. Most people won't get much out of it. And we did a report which showed, I think, altogether this proposal, people in the bottom fifth would actually pay $63 more, and people in the middle also don't really see any gain. So I don't think that the proposal is going to benefit most Ohioans from the standpoint of literally just are they getting money back. But I think also that we've tried this before. You know, we cut taxes in 2005 over a period of years by 21%, almost the same amount as the 20% here. And we have 7.5 years. We can look at what happened. Well, what did happen? Ohio has lost 230,000 jobs, while the nation, over that whole time period, has seen an increase. Our income has fallen more than the nation's have. Our output, by every major economic index, Ohio has underperformed the country since the 2005 tax cuts, which we were told at the time would be this great, important thing that would help our economy. And people say, well, you know, we had a big recession, you know, you can't expect it. Well, you know, the rest of the country went through that recession too. And, you know, the fact is that we haven't done well. And if you look at the budget itself, they have an economic forecast that they use to develop the figures of, you know, what will be the tax revenue that's brought in. And if you look at the budget, you'll find that the forecast for the next 2 years is for Ohio to underperform the country on income, on output. So the very people who are telling us that this is something we ought to do are acknowledging in the budget itself that this doesn't work. So why would we do it again?
John Begala, you don't necessarily agree that it's such a bad idea to cut taxes. Tell me your thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, it would be, what's curious about the income tax cut, to me anyway, is that there's another set of income taxes in Ohio that probably are a bigger problem for businesses to cope with, and those are the municipal income taxes. Ohio is one of 4 states that have municipal income taxes. We have them, I think, in somewhere over 500 cities. They apply to business income as well as individual income. And businesses that operate in multiple communities, franchises, and that sort of thing have complained about this sort of thing for years. And there has been legislation introduced in the last General Assembly to try to start to sort through, is there some way of fixing that? They haven't come up with a silver bullet yet. But it's curious that that isn't on the table as part of this budget, because if there is a tax that causes issues relative to other states in particular, it's probably that one. Looking at the tax code in Ohio, too, together, Zach makes a very good point. There have been a lot of changes, and it would make a lot of sense to kind of take a deep breath and say, let's look at the big picture. For 40 years, the proportion of state taxes paid by businesses has been declining. The proportion paid by consumers and families has been increasing in combination. So the shift from, you know, from income to consumption, does that change much? Probably not. Those sorts of things, it would be nice if we could have the process, you know, to look at the whole thing and say, is there some rebalancing here that ought to be done? And putting the municipal income tax question there next to this one, I think, would be a discussion worth having. But that can't happen when you've got a live budget going through the General Assembly. And that's what we've got right now. So
well, there is actually a very active discussion of what's called House Bill 5, which is the municipal income tax proposal that was didn't get through in the last General Assembly. And I think the couple of notable things about that are it isn't really a serious effort to modernize the municipal income tax because it doesn't take on tax avoidance. But I guess that's a separate discussion. I think the broader point, though, is that this, together with Governor Kasich's proposal on the sales tax, each of these two things represent a major attack on local governing authority. And the municipal income tax would, as the House bill would lay out, it would take away a great deal of the authority of localities, which, you know, some of it might make sense, but given that they've suffered a $1 billion cut from the state recently, I can see why they don't want to see more. Yeah. At the same time, the budget bill that the governor has proposed, we've talked a little bit about how it would broaden the sales tax and would mean that you'd pay sales tax on a whole variety of services that you don't now.
Consulting a lawyer, getting a haircut.
Exactly right, all kinds of things like that. And
doing both at the same time.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you know, we think that's a good idea for the same reasons John outlined here, that it makes sense to you know, that's where the economy has shifted, and over time, you know, you got to have an adequate tax system, and the sales tax won't be viable if you don't tax services. But As a part of that, the governor is so concerned that counties don't benefit from that, because you see, of course, we have our local county sales tax, we have the RTA with their tax, and of course if you broaden the base, they too would get additional revenue. And the governor doesn't like that idea, so he would limit that to a much more modest amount. And then he's come up with this Rube Goldberg mechanism to make sure of how much the counties, they only get so much. And a part of that mechanism is that he would prohibit the counties from raising sales taxes for 3 years. So it's another kind of power grab by Columbus, and one which is, to my mind, not just an incursion on local authority. It's basically a way to get what he wants done and take away power from the people at the local level who may experience, what if we have another economic meltdown a year from now? Or Franklin County, for example, right now is considering this, quite apart from all of these proposals. If they don't get their sales tax increase on the ballot in the next few weeks for the May election, they won't be able to put it on the ballot for 3 years.
If this were to go through.
If this were to go through.
So wouldn't their representatives advocate for that in this budget process?
Well, you'll have to talk with the people from Columbus to find out where they are on it. But I mean, I see these two things as a kind of a very interesting move by the leaders of our state government to take a lot more of the power away and take it at the state level, which isn't what you would expect from people of their political persuasion.
Let me ask you about the 50% cut in business taxes, small business taxes. The rationale for that is when you cut business taxes, there's more money to be spent on job creation. The whole idea of this is economic prosperity through tax cutting. Why won't that work in your eyes?
I don't see, to flip it around, I'd like to see some evidence that it will work. They're doing this through exempting a portion of the of S corporation income that's passed through to shareholders and to proprietors, and how that money finds its way back into the small business enterprise, and how the amounts that would be available would somehow yield higher employment or investment and job creation is hard to see. So you get $12,000, more, or you pay less, $12,000 less in taxes, which is about, I think, where this thing maxes out. That'll, if you decide, well, I'll put this money back into the corporation, that would cover a minimum wage employee about 30 hours a week. So where's the job creation part of this? Now, I suppose that, if you're spending it in other areas somehow or another, the magic hand will lift that up, but that's the theory. But there's no data to support this, and absent that, this is important. What's especially troubling about that, I think, is that on the one hand, the governor is closing tax expenditures on the sales tax, which makes a lot of sense, broaden the base. On the other hand, he's opening up a whole new tax expenditure here without giving it an adequate review. And having some sort of regular provision for tax expenditures as you do appropriations that are part of the process, not only when they're proposed, you've got a series of criteria. What is the public benefit to that expenditure? That's what this represents, as a tax expenditure. Show that and then periodically review it with the sunset provision. Those are things that ought to be put in the table in the budget and specifically applied to this provision. Because taking it on faith that somehow or another magically this is going to increase employment or improve the economy, I think is just not tested at this point.
It should be mentioned we had hoped to get the budget director for the state, Tim Keene, on the program, and was not available for this forum today, because it would have been good to get an answer to exactly the point that you're bringing up.
But I think also that, as John said, the amount that most business owners will get, and this is really not just small business owners. It's been presented as a small business exemption, but it's anyone who owns a part of a business that's organized in one of these various forms, a limited liability company, an S corporation, a partnership. And the tax commissioner testified the other day in Columbus that there's 700,000 taxpayers in that class. And so the amount that people will get is actually very small, and the idea that this will generate a lot of new jobs, to me, seems pretty unlikely. And the loophole also, you create a situation where half of your income, half of somebody's income of a certain type is exempt. Well, don't you think there'll be ways found to make sure that more income is of that type? So, I mean, the bill just came out, and I haven't even had a chance yet to read over the details of how that's put together, but I think that there's a good likelihood this is going to be another huge tax avoidance vehicle.
I'm on page 3090. Where are you? Almost done.
You started at the back.
Right. Let's move on, before we go to our question and answer period, to the issue of education. And the announcement that the governor made, which was, listen, it's pretty simple. It was almost like a read my lips announcement. It was the poor will get more, the rich will get less. Essentially, this is a way to balance out the way the state funds more than 600 school districts. It's important to note that this isn't all school funding. In fact, many of the wealthy districts, a very small percentage of their funding comes from the state. But the idea was to balance that out. But then when the numbers came out, a lot of people were scratching their heads. You saw districts like Orange or Avon Lake that appear to be pretty well-to-do districts getting a whole lot more money from the state. Some districts that were struggling, like Cleveland, East Cleveland, places like that, that weren't getting more money. And in fact, we're only getting the same because of a guarantee that the state has put in for this next 2 years, a guarantee that cost over $400 million and that the governor says can't be sustainable. Eventually that's going to fall off, so plan for that. So when you look at the state budget funding formula, what do you make of it? Is it an attempt, and does it succeed in equalizing the way funding is given to these districts, or was it sold as that and it comes out as something completely different? Zach?
Well, I think it was sold as that, and it comes out as something completely different, to give you the short answer, right? I think, again, we should start by looking at what's the overall amount that's being spent here. And if you go back to the last budget, the way that we balanced the budget 2 years ago, we had this big budget crisis. We were told $8 billion, whatever the amount was. It was obviously a big budget hole. We had that budget hole, by the way, because we had cut taxes by so much that was costing us $2.5 billion a year. But how did we balance the budget 2 years ago? Well, we did it by cutting support to school districts and local governments. And this budget does not really do anything for local governments. It leaves them basically where they were with those cuts intact. At least doesn't cut them anymore, by any major amount, which is a big accomplishment these days. But then for the school districts, while I don't have a precise number, it's clear that it does not bring us close to where we were in terms of the previous level of spending at the state level.
Well, it's supposed to be a $1.2 billion additional funding boost, but the critics would say that there was a slightly larger cut in the last budget.
Well, hundreds of millions larger, certainly. And so, what I'd like to say is, why are we going to cut income taxes by $400 million, which is another part of the plan, which actually might make up most of that difference? There's going to be an income tax cut that most people in this audience or most people who might be listening won't even know happened because it'll be so small. And but you take all those small amounts together, and it'll add up to $400 million. Well, interesting that that would make up most of the difference that the schools are feeling from previously.
I've got a little bit different perspective on this. I don't disagree essentially with what Zach is saying with regard to the taxes. On the other hand, sort of big picture, a lot of people are saying, at the federal level, look, we've got a president who he is the president. Like it or not, his policies are what they are, and Congress ought to be working with them. Similarly, we've got a conservative governor. There are some policies here people may not like, but he is the governor, and there are some things here that are worth considering, part of which are where we started. Yes, indeed, and looking backwards, we still haven't caught up with state spending to where it is. But I did run a few numbers for this through what we've got. City of Cleveland doesn't get anything more per pupil in this budget as it was proposed. On the other hand, average spending in Cuyahoga County, which has 32 school districts, I think, average spending for the suburban districts, $3,600 a year per pupil. This is state aid only. $3,600 per year from the state. City of Cleveland, about double that, $7,000. We already have a system that drives significant dollars to low-income districts. Even more so if you look at East Cleveland. State aid there over $10,000 per pupil annually. If you take East Cleveland and Cleveland out of the mix and just look at the other suburbs in town, the difference gets much higher. You've got about $2,000 to $2,500 a year in state aid to the other Cuyahoga County suburbs, and the two urban districts with high concentrations of low-income people getting considerably more. This is repeated in community after community around the state of Ohio. Some urban districts like Canton, Youngstown do get more in this thing. So the formula, as you work its way through, and I don't pretend to have this formula committed to memory or anything like it, and I defy anybody else to as well. There are about 10 to a dozen different factors that work their way into how the money is distributed,
including the growth of the district and the population.
Yeah, and that's a significant piece of it too.
Which is going up in these more wealthy
areas. Yes, it is. So all things considered, considering that you have a conservative governor, there's nothing in this budget particularly that erodes support to those low-income districts. And it does maintain in some districts that are losing students, that is, losing population. That is not something that I would consider optimal. On the other hand, I don't think that it's something that on its face ought to be discounted. There are voters in those other 600 or so non-urban districts in the state of Ohio too, whose return from state dollars hasn't been what it's been for the urban districts for quite some time. And I think that part of the balance needs to be considered in the discussion too. It's fair.
So Jim Foster jump in now, and if anyone here tested out of Honors Calculus 2, perhaps you can tell us what this formula is. Maybe you can figure it out. I know somebody in this audience will know. Jim Foster.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum discussing Ohio Governor John Kasich's proposed two-year state budget. Our panel includes John Begala, Executive Director of the Center for Community Solutions, and Zach Schiller, Research Director for Policy Matters Ohio. And our panel is moderated by Mike McIntyre, columnist for The Plain Dealer and host of WCPN's Sound of Ideas. We will return to our speakers in a moment. For our traditional City Club questions, please think of your questions now and remember to be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those listening to 90.3 WCPN Idea Stream. WCLV, WTAM are one of the many radio stations across the country that broadcast City Club forums. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ, PBS Idea Stream, and television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron and closed captioning by the Nordson Corporation. And now we would like to return to our speakers for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphone today is Program Director Carrie Miller. First question, please.
Thank you. Mr. Begala and Mr. Schiller, in the State of the Union, the President lauded a public and private success at Youngstown. I was wondering, from your review of the governor's budget, whether or not there's adequate support for such public-private partnerships in areas like Summit County and Akron, and if you're encouraged by the success of those types of programs in the future.
John Begala, would you like to
I
start?
really couldn't say. I'm sorry I haven't looked at that part of the budget, and Ohio's had numerous initiatives in that direction for a number of years, including, I think, Third Frontier support of that program over there in Youngstown, but I can't say beyond that.
I would say that I too have not looked at it closely enough to give you what would be anything like an adequate answer, but I think that part of the answer is that you'll never know because a big chunk of our economic development function has been privatized and is not something we can look at, which is in Jobs Ohio. So, that's unfortunate, and so we won't be able to get a full answer to your question.
We'll take another question. I wanted to let you know the City Club rules I'm looking at here. Keep your question brief and questions only. My rule is if you don't ask a question, I'm calling on someone anyway. So raise your hands. Let's get some questions. Let's have this be an interactive experience. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. Ohio Supreme Court has ruled 4 times that the way Ohio funds its schools is unconstitutional. mainly because of the over-reliance on property taxes. So where a child lives determines the quality of his or her education. This budget has been promoted as having finally addressed the rulings by the Ohio Supreme Court. But when I hear that poor districts are not getting additional money, rich districts are getting more, it seems to be just the opposite. So I'd like to see if this budget really does address that ruling or those rulings.
The DeRolf decision is what's being referred to here, and this budget doesn't change the fact that most of school funding would still come from property taxes. It doesn't address the central tenet of that particular ruling.
It depends on look at what's happened here in Cleveland.
Zach Schiller, jump in first.
What have we seen here in the city of Cleveland? A giant property tax levy that was well supported, obviously, and people agreed that they felt they needed. The bulk of that levy merely covered the decline in state support in the previous budget. So we've actually done the exact opposite of what was envisioned. Instead of the state stepping in and trying to even things out or make things easier for those districts, it's done the opposite. And I think that you know, we shouldn't be looking at just the dollar amounts that districts are getting. Our goal here, as I think the DeRolf decision indicated, is we want to give opportunity to any student wherever they are, and looking at their circumstances, providing them with the tools and the educational services that are needed so that they can succeed. And so obviously in some places that's a greater amount than others, and that is the state's responsibility as it ought to be. I think also that I have to part company with John's statement that there's nothing in this budget that erodes the urban districts. There's a major increase in the voucher program that would now cover, I think, about half the students in the state. And there's also new money for charter schools, which have been remarkably unaccountable and while sometimes very effective, and sometimes there are some very good examples, obviously, of successful charters, all too many instances not particularly successful either in educating students. So I don't feel that this is some positive budget for urban schools merely because we're maintaining their level. It may be predictable in the sense that you wouldn't expect much better, but I have higher expectations.
Well, obviously we disagree. I agree that it isn't just a matter of money. And if you look at the performance of urban schools, given the amount of money that is spent compared to the results that you get out in more affluent suburbs, obviously there are other issues at work here. Dealing with the underlying poverty is something that we continue to shirk our responsibility about. And dealing with the thing that I think here in the Cleveland Municipal School District with the school superintendent, the mayor's plan, we have some opportunities to try to deal with some of the qualitative issues that underlie school performance that have nothing to do with whether or not Cleveland is getting $7,500 per pupil from the state or what the other school districts in the area get from the state. So investment in those things in preschool education, which the president is promoting and which the state of Ohio has gradually expanded through the years, those sorts of investments are extremely important. They need to not only be flashes in the pan, though, not pilot projects. These are things that need to be investments that are made and which continue. On the other hand, though, I mean, to get back to the DeRolf decision question, I don't think the verdict is in on this yet, but the basic approach to try to get to a stable level of financing for the first 20 mills, which is kind of the way this stuff is put together, seems to work out in this budget. And leaving Cleveland aside, these are Northeast Ohio numbers. Lorraine City School District, going from $6,300 and change to over $7,000 per pupil. Youngstown, $7,300 to $7,600. Akron, $5,200 to $5,500. Canton from $6,100 to $6,900 per pupil. We are seeing in a number of urban districts, in other words, that there is increases in the aid. And I think one of the major drivers in Cleveland is the declining student population, which, as I recall, when Barbara Byrd Bennett took over, the schools are over 80,000 kids in the school district. The number that they're showing right now is about 57,000. And that leaves aside. With regard to vouchers, and I don't want to leave that one untouched, getting outside of our own little piece of Valhalla here, and looking to Northern Europe at those very conservative Scandinavian countries, and what they've been doing for the last 20 years. They increasingly, in order to keep their welfare state, which makes ours look rather scrawny in some ways, they have little by little re-engineered the entire system, and including on the schools, they're very actively going after vouchers and creating competitive situations for their schools there. The point is that the idea of vouchers, which has been anathema to the political left for years and years and years, little by little people are starting to say, well, why not? You know, put the buying power in the hands of people and let them go shopping. Why is that such a terrible idea? Well, in part because there are all kinds of entrenched interests in all of this, but even taking, those things off the table, you want to go slow on doing these things. But it has been going slowly, and in some places we're seeing some remarkably good results. On the other hand, going slowly has been wise because in some places with some charters we have seen remarkably bad results. Getting that right and expanding the idea of school choice is not something that ought to be taboo. It ought to be part of the mix. It's going to continue to be part of the mix, and we can look at the experience of other countries and say, we're not the only ones experimenting with this. Maybe there's something there that we can, once we get over our initial gut level response to where this is coming from, maybe there's some substance under there that's worth further pursuing.
Our next question, please. Oh, and we'll let you jump in on that in a minute, Zach.
One question I have is, during this bad economy, certain states are doing good. We're not doing good. What are these other states doing that we're not doing? There must be some formula that we're missing. One question. The other thought is, we have great universities in the state. Are they working with the cities to create jobs like MIT and Boston, those kind of things? How are we doing compared to other states?
That's a great question. I think the idea of, people are very concerned about young people, and if you look at migration patterns, young people are leaving Ohio, and there are a lot of people now that all of a sudden this is up there on the surface again, and people are scratching their heads. What can we do to get young people to Ohio? Leaving the state colleges and universities aside, Ohio has more private colleges than I think all but a few states. And we have huge numbers of young people coming to Ohio every year for their higher education, from the East Coast and from around the Midwest especially. What we do to try to keep some of those people here is a very good question. I don't have the answer for you today, but you raise a good point, and it's something that we ought to be investing in, and not just in the state colleges and universities, but in the private schools in places like Granville and Springfield and Urbana and so forth. Engaging those kids and figuring out where the opportunities are, there might be some interesting things we could do differently there.
There are some aspects of this budget that address higher education as well. In terms of tuition.
Yeah, I think it's another example of where, there's a 2% tuition cap, although it's sort of a soft cap. It's not a straight across the board thing. We've reduced our aid to our need-based aid. It's up modestly in the budget, but Ohio has, broadly speaking, less affordable colleges and universities than the rest of the country. Yeah. And what are we doing about it? Well, I mean, a 2% tuition cap doesn't cut it. We need to go a lot further than that. And we need the resources to do it. And what are we doing instead? We're cutting taxes. Yeah, that's what we're doing. We could put that money into more scholarships. We could say, how about tuition reductions? This is not something that couldn't be done. We've decided of course, we'll see what happens with the budget, but the governor, in his proposal anyway, has said he wants you to have, some small amount more money in your pocket, and actually, for most people, it isn't even that, instead of investing in colleges and universities so that people can afford it.
Yeah. Next question, please.
Yeah.
I rise to respond to McIntyre's vicious attack against lawyers.
That's Jose Feliciano from
Yeah,
Baker
sure
House,
it is.
that
Yeah. Look, guys, I am not an economist, but you have said something that is just fundamentally different from what how I understand economy and taxes work, and that is that if you cut taxes, that the economy grows, and I think each of you challenged that in different ways. I mean, John Kennedy cut taxes, and it worked pretty well. Bush cut taxes and helped and grow the economy. And if you gave me $12,000 back, I know what I'd do with it. I'd invest it. If you gave my wife $12,000, I know what she'd do with that too. But either way, the money is getting, one's invested, the other's spent. Don't both of those grow the economy?
Well, I think a couple of things. I mean, your history, you're being quite selective here. First of all, under Bush, the economy did not grow very well, and we experienced that firsthand here in Ohio. We had tax increases under other presidents, and the economy did quite well, thank you, as in Mr. Clinton, and we had extremely high rates in the 50s, and the economy did pretty well then too. So I don't think that your history is exactly correct. But if you look at it at the state level, we have to balance the budget. So when you cut somebody's taxes, you have to either raise some other revenue to make up for it, or you have to cut spending. And that may sound great. Okay, you know, we want to cut spending. A lot of people take that view these days. Cut spending, cut spending. Well, what does that really mean at the state level? Well, it means you're going to be laying off teachers or taking money away from local governments so that they're laying off cops and firefighters and sanitation workers, or nurses' aides in the health system. And those people go out and they spend money. They buy cars, they go to the movies, they go to the grocery store, and when you lay them off, it's the same thing as if you laid off a worker at the Ford Brook Park plant. It's the same impact on the economy. And so when you talk about cutting taxes at the state level, the likelihood, while it's true, yes, there's some economic impact of cutting taxes. You couldn't deny that. But there's also an economic aspect of it, of what happens when you have to cut the spending. And what's been shown, I think, and there was a study, for instance, done by a couple of the economists at the Cleveland Federal Reserve Bank a few years back. They looked very extensively at state economic growth over a